Okay. Now, there are other forms of the difference quotient, infinitely many possible forms, because instead of x, you can use t, or q, or z, or Aleph null, or anything you want to. Aleph null wouldn't be a real good choice. But you could use any symbol, any name you wanted to for x. And instead of delta x, well, you would probably use delta of whatever the symbol you used for x. However, maybe not. So many times you want to talk about something that's a function of time, like the position of a ball rolling down a ramp is a function of time. So t is often your variable. So we could use t for the variable, in which case our difference quotient would probably be written f of t plus delta t minus f of t over delta t. Okay? Now, you don't even have to use a delta t or a delta x. You could express this as f of x plus h minus f of x over h. Instead of delta x, you use h, where h means the same thing delta x does, but you express it as h. And many authors do that at this stage of the course. I don't know how it splits. I think it's fairly even. I've seen h a lot, I've seen delta x a lot by authors. Doesn't matter. The idea is the same. And we'll see how that works. You could even use q for your variable and aardvark for the change in that variable. You couldn't do q plus aardvark unless aardvark had was the same kind of quantity as q, because you can't add two different kinds of quantities. It'd be like unlike terms. So somehow aardvark would have to be related to q. But this is more whimsical than anything. You could write f of q plus aardvark minus f of q over aardvark, and that would be a perfectly valid difference quotient. Now, I don't know what aardvark stands for. It's going to stand for a change in your q variable. It's not going to stand for that animal that eats ants. Okay, so these are just different possible forms of your difference quotient. Now, we ask, okay, what's the difference quotient if f of x equals x squared, if f of x equals 1 over x, if f of x equals the square root of x, if f of x equals 1 over the square root of x? What's the difference quotient in each case? Well, remember, the difference quotient represents an average rate. It's the average rate of change of x, of f of x with respect to x. So the difference quotient represents average rate of change of f of x with respect to x, or of whatever, average rate of change of f of t with respect to t, okay, average rate of change of f of q with respect to q, whatever. Okay, so I'm going to express the difference quotient. I'm going to write average rate instead of writing difference quotient equals, but the average rate will be the difference quotient. So if it's f of x equals x squared, well, our variable is x, and we're used to using delta x instead of h, so I'm going to use delta x. I'll probably use h in one of these to show you it doesn't make a lot of difference. Okay, the average rate would be what? It's f of x plus delta x minus f of x, because if your value is x and then that value changes by delta x, then you're going to be evaluating f at x and at x plus delta x to get the change in x, and make sure you review if necessary to understand why that is. That's over delta x. Okay, well, if f of x equals x squared, what's that equal to? That's x plus delta x squared minus x squared, because f of x is x squared. F of x plus delta x would be x plus delta x quantity squared divided by delta x. Now, at this stage, a lot of people will write down, instead of like x plus delta x squared, they'll write down x squared plus delta x. Well, that's not what f of x plus delta x means. F of x plus delta x means you replace x in this definition with delta x, x plus delta x. So you've got to replace this x with x plus delta x. You just don't tack a delta x on the end of it, okay? Then of course, we get into expanding this and simplifying this. And that's actually very straightforward. Quantity x plus delta x squared is x squared plus 2x delta x plus x squared. And then you have your minus x squared, and you have your delta x down here. Okay? I didn't leave myself enough room to write all the details of this thing out. And I was careless here. I wrote x squared where I should have written quantity delta x squared. So let me fix that. And you want to be careful about that. Don't do like I do. Hopefully that's sensible. Okay? And you don't want to forget this 2x delta x. Remember that x plus delta x quantity squared is x plus delta x multiplied by x plus delta x. If you use the distributive law twice, you get this, and you have to know that. So if you don't, ask me or figure it out. Not too difficult, but make sure you understand. Okay, well, what happens with this expression? The x squared, got an x squared here and x squared here, goes away. You end up with 2x delta x plus delta x squared over delta x. And of course now you can, division by delta x is the same as multiplication by reciprocal delta x. So, and that multiplication would distribute over the addition sign. So it means you got to do 1 over delta x times 2x delta x, which gives you 2x. And delta x squared over delta x, which gives you delta x. So this difference quotient is easy to write down if you are careful and, substitute correctly into the function notation. And then if you're careful and carefully square that quantity, you get this and so forth. Okay? And everything works out. So make sure you understand that. Now, what if f of x equals 1 over x? What do you get? How would you simplify it? You might not get all that far in simplifying it. I know I had to be shown, and then it seemed pretty obvious, but there are tricks, algebra tricks, that we might or might not be completely good with. What if f of x is the square root of x? Again, not hard to write down the difference quotient. You just write it down carefully, then see if you can do anything to simplify it. What if it's 1 over square root of x? What does that do? What if it's sine of x? What do you get? So you might want to think through these, at least write down the first step so you don't have to spend time watching me write down the first step. Okay? I'll do that in the next video.